This is the Fundamentals podcast, where we demystify crypto and help you navigate this ever-evolving internet-native economy. In this episode, I'm joined by Rune Christensen, a founder of MakerDAO, a decentralized stablecoin protocol built on Ethereum, and the first ever DAO. Maker recently published their Endgame plan, which is a roadmap for a significant overhaul and improvement to the governance and tokenomics of the Maker ecosystem. Its primary aim is for the ecosystem to reach a self-sustainable equilibrium called the Endgame State. In this episode with Rune, the mastermind behind the Endgame plan, we discuss why this overhaul is needed and how it will affect the Maker ecosystem. We go through the details of the plan's 5 different phases, including unifying branding, the introduction of subDAOs, leveling the playing field for governance and incentivizing participation, and finally launching a new blockchain. Tune in for an insightful discussion about how these changes are expected to position Maker for mass adoption and take mainstream the innovative concepts crypto has introduced over the years. Hello, Rune. Welcome to the Fundamentals podcast. It is great to have you on.
Glad to be here.
You recently introduced a major update to MakerDAO called the Endgame, which aims to streamline and parallelize the Maker ecosystem through brand unification, launch of subDAOs, introducing AI tools for governance, participation incentives as well, and then also deploying a new chain. Now, you spoke about the very basics of this 5-phase update in a few pods, and I'm hoping we can dive into some of the reasoning and the effects that you see these updates having on the Maker ecosystem in this session. To set the stage, it would be great if you can just provide an overview of the goals and the vision behind the Endgame update for MakerDAO. So what motivated the need for these changes?
Maker is, it's actually the first ever DAO, a very old project in Ethereum. And from the beginning, the objective was always to create, first of all, a decentralized stablecoin, right? That was autonomous and self-running and useful, which is kind of one of the things that stablecoins have proven to be one of the few things in crypto that definitely have a very obvious real-world use case. And then on top of that, there's been this natural importance and sort of synergy with also developing a real decentralized autonomous organization. Because you can't really have, a stablecoin that's decentralized requires governance and sort of regulation that is also decentralized, right? And that in many ways, that's really the big difference between centralized and decentralized stablecoins is whether it's a company that sits and sort of runs it based on sort of their own internal processes, or if it's a DAO that runs it based on these like open, transparent processes and decision-making methods, voting, etc. So when we launched the first version of DAI back in 2017. It was one of the very first crypto like smart contract products and sort of advanced smart contracts to ever be launched. But it was also definitely it was absolutely the most secure smart contract ever made at that point, right? Where we pioneered things like formal verification. And generally Maker has always been like at the absolute forefront of security and sort of technical security, technical verification, right? Really being proactive with preventing the risk of bugs or hacks and so on, right? That could put the value and the stability of the collateral at risk. Because a stablecoin is all about stability and sort of security of your funds, right? But then what basically happened is after we launched DAI all the way back in 2017, what we've realized over the last 6 years is that one thing is making the technical layer super secure, right? And sort of the stablecoin itself, making that really secure. But the DAO component has sort of its own vulnerabilities and challenges and risks. And Endgame is basically taking this same security mindset and not just applying it to the technical layer, but also applying it to the governance layer. And basically, just like you want to build a smart contract that can't be hacked, you need to build a governance system that can sort of break through things like politics or misalignment, mismatched incentives. All these like things that basically occur when you throw humans into the mix, which honestly took us a really long time to kind of realize that this was as important as the technology, which interestingly enough, and I've talked about this at length in other podcasts, right? But a lot of it stems from like the ideology of crypto and sort of the early ideological kind of starting point of I think many people in crypto, right? That had this idea that like libertarians are just superior, something like that, right? And turns out, well, no, it doesn't work like that. Like humans are humans, and and especially when you're building something that you want to be autonomous and self-sustainable forever, right? Then you've got to prepare for the worst, just like you expect hackers to attack your smart contracts. So Endgame basically is based on like deconstructing this fundamental problem of governance and human incentives and human interactions and group dynamics and so on. And then basically kind of accepting that this is reality and then safeguarding against all the pitfalls through these very basically carefully designed rules and processes meant to sort of provide checks and balances on all the different ways that humans are involved in the governance processes and all the different incentives that all these humans have as they're involved, to sort of make it all balance out in a sense, and ultimately make it enforce a long-term decentralized equilibrium that doesn't kind of break or centralize due to a power vacuum or something like that. And then we use a lot of very specific techniques that are basically based on all the best and most innovative solutions that have been seen in DeFi and in crypto. I mean, since over the last 8.5 years, Maker has been going, right. So we kind of taking Maker from being sort of one of the most, I guess you could say, primitive and sort of old school crypto projects, and then catapulting it all the way to the forefront of being like by far the most innovative and most kind of advanced in terms of really tapping into the true potential of what can be done with things like cryptoeconomics, tokenomics, like Web3 style, like marketing and user adoption, community building, all of these things, and then kind of really locking it down into this thing we call the Endgame State. That is then the sort of final, immutable, autonomous equilibrium that then governs Maker and the whole ecosystem and allows it to then, from that very stable base, a foundation in a sense, right? You build this very solid foundation, and then from there, that's where you can really have massive growth because you can parallelize, you can do lots of things in parallel, and you don't have to worry about things breaking because you focus so much on the security and the solidifying the fundamental rules of the system, which again goes back to the core principle of how DAO was created in the first place, which is make it super, super safe, and then you can scale it up to billions of dollars, right? And now it's something like make the governance really, really solid and safe, and you can scale up the number of contributors, the number of governance participants to hundreds and eventually thousands, and who knows, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands one day.
Yeah, I love that. So it's not just building something shiny, but taking the approach of fundamentally sound, long-term sustainable stuff. And I actually had a discussion a month or two back with Wouter Kampmann from the Maker Sustainable Ecosystem Scaling Core unit, where we spoke about your expenses dashboard and how budgets are allocated and how the DAO is structured to most efficiently coordinate capital and work. So I think everything you laid out there builds really well on top of that discussion we had before, because it was in a bit of an interesting time in the middle of this big transition towards the end game. But really excited to dive into the details behind the end game plan to understand how you're revamping that whole model. Now, starting from phase one, you mentioned rebranding and introducing a new stable and a new governance token. Why are you doing this, and how do you see that a unified brand and tokens contribute to the growth and resilience of MakerDAO?
Yeah, so first, it's very important to point out that the old tokens and sort of the old existing products and brands of DAO and MKR basically will not be messed with, right? So they'll just continue working the way they currently work. And Endgame and all these new mechanisms kind of solve the last problem, which is the governance part of it. But in many ways, you can just ignore that actually and just keep using DAO and MKR. And the difference will just be now they actually are sustainably governed for the long run. I mean, and if you just keep using them, that's the only difference you'll see, right? But a key goal, as I was mentioning earlier, of Endgame is this sort of combination of and sort of the synergy between basically resilience and growth, right? That decentralization is a way to generate resilience out of scale, right? Where you have more participants you have, the more secure and sort of locked down the equilibrium becomes, because I mean you basically got more eyes on the problems, right? You've got more people working together and ideally share the same values and the same sort of understanding of the norms and the rules that are in their best interest to enforce. So the new unified brand basically overcomes this problem of Maker today has a hard learning curve, and it's hard for people to get into it because there's this sense that it's very complex, which I mean it is, because it's a decentralized stablecoin, it's a DAO, like these things are super complex, just like the Federal Reserve is super complex, and any large corporation is unbelievably complex, right? But what you want to avoid is you don't want to push that right up in people's face and have that be the first impression they get is like, this is really complex, I don't know where to start. Like participating in DeFi and a DAO should be more like a video game, right? Like World of Warcraft is really complex, right? But that doesn't mean, that's still fun to get started with it, right? And you know where to start, you know how to participate, right? And that's kind of the idea of this sort of redesign and this focus on accessibility that Endgame brings to the table, that it should be almost like playing a video game, right? It should be like clear, where do you start? How do you get involved? What are like the easy first steps? You don't have to worry about all the complexity. That kind of runs itself. That takes care of itself, right? That's the whole point of a DAO. And then this all at the very beginning starts with the brand itself, right? And that's where today MakerDAO has this huge problem that, already from the get-go, there's not just one brand, there's like two brands. And like usually people get lost sort of already there, right? And typically just use DAI, and then that's kind of it. And it's very hard to, a lot of people use DAI without having any clue Maker is, right? So having a unified brand is just already a good starting point for having a chance to kind of reach people more broadly, that, I mean, onboard people into crypto that aren't even in crypto today by giving them a better and more simple and sort of friendly experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then phase two covers the idea of subDAOs, which represent a pretty significant shift in governance and decision making. So can you elaborate on the reasoning behind why you wanted to implement these born decentralized divisions within MakerDAO and how you think that this parallelization will benefit Maker?
Yeah, so I mean, with these basically new versions of DynamKR, right? These new, that we currently sort of call codename new stable and new gov token. The killer app of those, I guess you could say, right? The sort of the distinguishing feature of them is that they have this ability to farm subDAO tokens. And unless you're US based, have to point that out, unfortunately. But basically, I mean, one really basic role that this plays is this is a part of kind of the gamification and the user experience of it should be, it should be fun to save money. It should be fun and engaging to improve your finances, right? And to onboard into the global financial system. And so what this introduces is an experience that's different from just like putting money in the bank and then getting an interest rate. And that's kind of like, it's some kind of like, it feels like doing paperwork. Whereas farming, right, as we've seen in DeFi, right? This is kind of an interesting killer app in crypto in general, where it's fun, right? Even though in the end, what you're kind of doing is you're just making sort of financial decisions, right? Then what's been a big problem in DeFi and in crypto, unfortunately, is they came up with this great primitive of farming, but mostly it was basically abused to trick people into participating in Ponzi schemes, right? So subDAOs are totally different in that sense, that while they still have that sort of arcade game feel to them, right? That you can farm them and it's fun and it's engaging, right? And there's sort of different options. They're very sound businesses fundamentally, right? That are tied to Maker Core and Maker Protocol and basically the challenges and opportunities that the Maker Protocol has, right? So the most basic way to describe what do the subDAOs do, what's the purpose of them, and like why is it valuable to farm them out to people, right? And get a lot of participants in holding them. And this is, of course, this is an imperfect analogy, right? But it's a good way to kind of try to grasp it, right? Is to think of Maker Core as it sort of remains, because by having a subDAOs, it allows us to make Maker Core very, very simple. So Maker Core ends up playing a role that is, again, imperfect analogy, but is similar to a central bank, right? That doesn't deal directly with end customers. It doesn't give out loans to like companies or something like that, right? What the central bank does in this analogy is it provides capital to the commercial banks, right? And so in this analogy, which is again, it's not exactly like that, right? But it's a good way to understand it. The subDAOs basically act as these distribution points, right? Similar to commercial banks, that they generate DAI in bulk, or rather DAI and the new stablecoin in bulk from Maker Core, and then they allocate them out into the ecosystem through things like vaults, right? Like there's this example of Spark protocol. That's one of the first examples of like how having subDAOs sparks a lot of innovation, because they can all build things in parallel. They can come up with new innovative ways to distribute DAI out to end users, to allow people to generate DAI against collateral. Because I mean, it's been very difficult and quite slow for Maker in the past to do things like collateral onboarding and sort of these like top-down decision making and execution is just not what a giant safety focused, like security focused DAO like Maker is good at, right? And this sort of division between subDAOs and Maker Core allows Maker Core to just like focus even more on security, right? It's like it's the only thing that matters. It's security and managing tail risk, and then letting the subDAOs focus on what I call operational efficiency, right? How to distribute, how to grow, how to reach new target demographics, how to innovate on financial primitives, how to interoperate with different DeFi systems and protocols and different blockchains. All of that stuff is handled by the subDAOs, right? So as long as Maker Core sort of enforces the ground rules, which is things like don't take dangerous risk, right? And remain over collateralized. And, the more risk you take, the more over collateralized you need to be. And there's all these like rules around that, right? That are then sort of enforced on the subDAOs. And then the subDAOs from there, they can kind of like, they've got sort of free reign, right? Within those boundaries. So they can compete with each other. And ultimately, the ecosystem as a whole needs this like simple unified brand around. There's a simple currency, which we're developing this brand for it. That'll be sort of, this is the really easy to understand basic thing where you've got a currency. And it's fun because you can farm stuff with it. You don't just have to be locked into just getting a boring old interest rate. You can choose instead to actually farm different things if you want a more engaging experience. And then from there, it's like a video game, right? You can jump into the world if you want to go deeper there's all these subDAOs with their own unique ecosystems, brands, thesis, sort of business case, right? Target demographics, target languages, regions, cultures. The reality is you can't make one product that just like speaks to everyone, right? And I think a lot of crypto tries to do that, and it gets very bland and corporate to a large extent, right? So subDAOs allows all these like different levels of specialization, right? Some can be corporate if they want to target that segment, right? But then they can go all in on it, right? They can focus on institutional users and so on, right? Others can focus on the unbanked. Some can focus on, I don't know, gamers, Web3, whatever, right? Whatever works actually, right? I mean, the beauty of it is I don't have to know what works. The ecosystem is set up so that kind of the natural dynamics and incentives of it will figure out what works. And through basically an evolutionary process, that's what's going to end up happening. While the things that don't work, they'll just, not succeed, and they'll not be what ends up getting done, because they kind of, if they can't generate value, there's going to be no kind of fuel to take it further, right?
Yeah, that parallelization makes a lot of sense. Now, with these subDAOs and regarding like their autonomy, are you going to apply like the existing budget allocation model that you've had with like previous core units and everything else beforehand, or is that changing in any way?
A lot of the people I've talked to about Endgame, they've sort of spent a lot of time trying to understand it, and then at the end, they're sort of like, okay, so the whole thing, it's actually it's like a budgeting solution almost, right? The reality is that's like 95% of like DAO politics and challenges is budgeting. And then another thing that's almost as important, right, is like, I guess for Maker's case, it's more important, but it's like collateral allocation, right? But it's all these like relatively basic financial decisions, such as where to spend money, that are just, once you drill down on them, they become infinitely complex because of like politics, difference of opinion, right? Imperfect information, right? So, I mean, the absolute key kind of feature of subDAOs is they don't have top-down core unit style budgets at all. What they have is what I sometimes call self-contained KPIs. Basically, the way they fund their operations is directly through their own success, right? And maybe the most simple example of this is something called the accessibility reward. Because so one of the things, and this is kind of the basic logic, right? So one of the things that subDAOs they do is they operate front ends. So you have this sort of multiple front end ecosystem, right? So we want to have many different decentralized, resilient front ends. So there's not a single point that can fail, right? Or be captured or something. And so each subDAO runs its own. And to fund the operation of this front end, and to encourage them to build it and make it really good and useful and so on, and have it provide the best possible access to kind of like the core product of the stable coins and the farming opportunities. subDAOs are paid this thing called accessibility reward, which is basically something like a revenue share of the value they bring to make a call, right? So you don't have to make some kind of centralized, top-down, complicated political decision about, oh, these guys did that much, so they should get paid X, and over here you should be paid Y or whatever. It's fully autonomous. It's like, well, if you bring in $1 billion in DAI demand and new stable demand, then you get, I think currently the accessibility reward is 20 basis points. So that gives you 2 million DAI per year in budget, right? So it's that simple. Like, there's no discussion or debate or whatever. There's no unfairness, right? The same rules apply to everyone. And it's kind of a closed loop where the subDAOs can just take those basic rules, sort of that basic incentive, and then they can just go and operate, right? So they can operate much faster and leaner and smoother and tighter in their smaller, more focused groups, right? In addition to the accessibility reward, the other really big one is then this thing called the allocation system. That's this analogy I was talking about earlier with the central bank being MakerCore, and then the subDAOs being like a commercial bank, right? That the subDAOs have this unique privileged access to generate DAI in bulk at what's called the base rate, so the lowest possible rate in the system from MakerCore. And this is actually the only way to generate DAI out of MakerCore. So the subDAOs basically are the ones that allocate all the DAI and all the new stable into the marketplace. And then they can charge a spread, right? And so basically, the more effectively and sort of more utility they create by distributing the DAI out to the right place based on the right collateral, the higher spread they can charge, right? Because the more useful it is, the greater premium the market is willing to pay. So again, it's like they get rewarded for like making the right decisions that create the best utility for the end user, right? For instance, if they're really good at market making DAI and new stable and bring it out to the end users that need it the most, where there's most liquidity and where there's then they're naturally going to make more income from that, because they're providing it in a place where the activity is and where the demand is. So it's their own incentive to do that. Like, Maker governance doesn't have to sit and be like, you should put DAI over there or whatever, and try to sort of top down figure out where's the right place to provide liquidity for DAI. The profit motive just naturally drives the subDAO to do this. And this idea, right? I mean, this is really basically, it's about aligning incentives, right? And that really goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning of like, the fundamental idea is to sort of foolproof how the governance works. So you don't have to sit and police whether someone is doing what's best for the system or what's just best for themselves, right? You want to align incentives. So what's best for the subDAO is what's best for the system as a whole without having to resort to politics or top-down distribution of resources and so on. And this is really what makes them so exciting, because this is why you can then, once you have these basic building blocks in place, right, that's when you can kind of let them loose and you can parallelize them and you can make a lot of them, right? And so if it works, I mean, it's going to be super exciting to see, like, can you really just make more of them? And as you keep making more and more, the system just gets more and more intelligent in a sense, right? That's kind of how the subDAOs work. It's like they sort of slowly, more and more of them are just created. And then if some of them fail, then, I mean, they've got their own sort of P&L, right? They've got their own balance sheet, their own collateral, their own capital. If they make mistakes, if they can't figure out how to generate value, then they run out of capital and then they just die. And if they die, that's actually perfectly fine. It's sort of, the system is designed for that to happen. They need to be allowed to fail so they can be allowed to experiment. And when they fail, it's a good thing because it teaches everyone else what not to do, basically, right? And it sort of provides crucial data that is then, because everything is transparent, is because it's a DAO, right? All this data is very efficiently integrated across the rest of the ecosystem, right? As everyone else is trying to figure out which decision should I make that benefits myself the most, right? And I can see, okay, that didn't work. Well, let's not repeat that mistake, right? And then as the system just keeps going and keeps growing, it'll just naturally get more and more, I mean, resilient and valuable and able to grow.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I got to say, what you said in the end there, the subDAO model reminds me a lot about Supercells, you know, the gaming company behind Clash of Clans and other really successful games, where at the core of the company, kind of as their name states, you have these supercharged cells, which are small, independent game development teams that operate completely independently. And their like sole goal is to innovate, bring like super successful games to the market. And if you want to innovate, you're going to have to fail. And as far as I've understood like Supercell's culture, failure is like really highly celebrated because it's more than required for a company to be able to push out top 10 grossing games globally on a consistent basis. So I think that's at least one case that proves that this type of model works really well, and just had to mention that because it came to mind. But moving on to phase 3, it's very much focused around AI tools to enhance your governance processes. So can you speak about both the problem that these AI tools will solve, how they're going to solve it, and then what their role is in leveling the playing field for community members, as you state in the Endgame plan?
Yeah, so I touched upon this quite early, right? That the key to overcoming the problems with humans and incentives, and I mean, the principal agent problem, right? Where ultimately not everyone's got the same incentives, and people that sort of sit on the sidelines that are less involved, they have different interests. Usually they just want something like the token to go up or the system to get used more. Whereas someone who's like deeper in the system, their incentives can sometimes be something like accumulate more power and access more budget streams and so on, right? Build up more leverage, build up more information asymmetry. If you're thinking of them as like perfectly rational, selfish actors, right? And then like the solution that we realized is like the only thing that can reasonably replace a centralized hierarchy and a CEO and so on. I mean, because that's how you normally deal with this problem. That's the only way that sort of works in the real world today, right? Like there's no example in the real world today of like a flat organization with like a peer-to-peer structure actually scaling up to a large size. I mean, every single example you've got of that, once they reach a certain size, they become hierarchical and centralized because they have to. And that's, I guess it's sort of related to, you know, Dunbar's number, right? That there's just a certain point where you're no longer going to identify as much with the group as a whole as you are with like your small little group and sort of your own incentives, because you're beyond the point where you know everyone and you trust everyone. So the system stops being people and friends and it becomes more like just a faceless system. Anyway, and then you have to put in a CEO and you have to put in a hierarchy and sort of a mechanism to kind of police this kind of misalignment, right, as it occurs in an organization, right? So the solution that I mentioned, that is the way we think this can be dealt with, is lots and lots of rules and processes and documentation, basically. You know, something like, let's say we have a subDAO that wants to do a marketing plan for something, right? A marketing push in Japan, right? Then a really typical issue is like, okay, well, who do we hire to do this work, right? Who do we pick as the provider that we want to actually give a grant of, you know, some money, and then they'll go out and do a marketing push, right? And then maybe there's like 3 different options. And the question is, which one of those 3 do you pick? And this is like, I mean, this is a age-old problem, right? But like what you have then in a DAO, I mean, in the maker ecosystem, we call them facilitators, right? You've got someone who sort of has to ultimately make the choice you could also have token holders themselves, but actually even token holders suffer from the same problem anyway, right? And so the issue is the one who's making the choice of which of these suppliers to pick, like their incentive is to pick whoever benefits them to pick, right? Like so then you immediately run into the problem of like nepotism, for instance, right? That if there's 3 suppliers and one of them is like my nephew's company or even my own company or something, then my incentive is going to be to pick that if there's no other constraints. So the system has to be able to go beyond just like ask for bids and then pick whoever you feel like picking, right? It has to be like get a lot of very detailed data about what are the different proposals and then kind of like apply a sort of almost like an algorithm to hold up these different pieces of data and pick the right one based on who's got the best price, who's got the best track record, who's got the best quality, who's got the best blah, blah, all these like metrics. I mean, ultimately it's all about data, kind of data, and then sort of applying an algorithm to that data to figure out which is the right one to pick, right? So we need to have written down processes and rules that basically describe best practice for things like what does it mean to have a track record? What does it mean to have a good price? Like there's also weird things like what does it mean if a price is like too low? Suspiciously low, right? That's also a piece of data that you have to be able to handle, right? And all of this data, and all of the kind of the internal data that helps with like sort of the algorithmic stuff that helps with integrating this external data and sort of holding them together to make the decision about what's the best option to pick here, for instance, right? That is all codified in Maker in what we call the alignment artifacts. So the alignment artifacts is basically, it's something like a pseudo legal system almost. I mean, it's like a very large set of rules and that are almost like laws of the DAO in a sense, right? Except they don't have any legal significance. They have sort of a cryptoeconomic incentive impact, right? Yeah, in some sense, what they help is they help everyone to align themselves with the system and understand what's in my best interest, what action is in my best interest to take, and then it makes sure that individuals understand, like are sort of guided towards taking the actions that are not only in their own best interest, but also in the system's best interest as a whole. And where the AI comes in is basically, I mean, this thing is like, it's a giant rule set, right? So currently it's about 130 pages of rules, right? And today it's just in its very, very early, super shallow stage. So it will grow to become 100 times, 1,000 times as big over time as we start like sort of at scale integrating as much data as possible, right? Learning from failures, like learning from successes, right? Getting in expert opinions and advice, right? And the downside to this approach is, or rather, this is just a fundamental downside. I was discussing this earlier, right? Is that you've got people on the outside that are not too involved, but that are actually quite aligned because they just want the token to be valuable and the product to succeed. But then you've got sort of the insiders that have all the special knowledge and their incentives can be different than the ecosystem as a whole, right? And this is a big problem because you've got information asymmetry, you've got complexity asymmetry. And one way to actually deal with this is through the rules, right? Because of, there was a nepotism problem earlier, right? Of like, you can have rules that kind of make it easy to figure out was something done the way it should be done, or was it done in some unexplainable way that may hint at there being some misalignment occurring, right? And what the AI tools basically do is they just make this, like accessing all this data so much easier, right? Because that's something that LLMs, right, large language models and sort of the current generation of AI is incredibly good at. I would describe it as doing paperwork essentially, right? So it can like summarize information, it can extrapolate data and sort of, so it can both on one hand help accessing all this data, kind of like traversing it, right, searching through it and being like, so one of the things we want the governance AI tools to be able to do is to have an average user that are like, okay, I want to check in on Maker, but I'm not going to look through like all 200 proposals that are happening right now. I just want to ask the AI, what's the proposal right now that is kind of the most suspect? Like if I have to focus on one thing and try to figure out if things are going well, where do we have the most data pointing towards something not being totally clean and being more controversial, right? And then that's where the humans can sort of direct their attention towards the things that are more complicated, right? It could be some kind of edge case that related to, let's say, marketing, right? Where the rules just weren't set up correctly to handle. This is an example I like to bring up, right? It's like there's someone offering to do some work and they're just offering like a suspiciously low price. And the data might say, okay, just pick them. But then humans will step in and be like, nah, that's, we're not going to pick someone who's going to say they'll do it for $100, right? It seems like we're just going to lose $100 and nothing will happen, right? And so then humans can kind of step in and then they can kind of, synergize and work together with the AI in a sense where the AI and the system can kind of do things. They can get it sort of 90% of the way, right? 80%, 90% of the way. And then humans can then make sure they only spend their time doing the remaining, 20% of the work and not the boring 80%. That's just paperwork that you can have a machine do, right? And then this way you can take someone who's sort of on the periphery and actually you can get them to be quite deeply involved and have some very meaningful contribution as well as, be a real check and a real counterbalance to the insiders. So that ultimately, and this is the best part, right? What this means is then again, I mean, just like I was talking about with letting the subDAOs roam free, right? This means you can let the insiders, you can really let them do their thing. Because like with this kind of system, you can trust that if they do something wrong, you will catch them in the act, essentially, right? You don't have to constantly worry about something's happening in a black box you don't understand. You can have the AI tools. I mean, you can ask it, what's going on? Is there something in this black box? Like, what's suspicious? What should I look at to understand whether something's wrong here? And it will be possible, even if you're like a relatively uninvolved outsider, right? That's really the holy grail as I see it, right? That in the end, you completely level the playing field where, I mean, it's like using ChatGPT, right? That makes anyone feel an expert in whatever subject, right? And this is like that, but it's just specifically for maker governance.
That's such a massive unlock. I feel that the complexity and then the abundance of data related to all governance processes has just been such a bottleneck and built such a barrier for people to even be interested in like entering and trying to participate. Then in phase 4, you also highlight governance participation rewards. Can you speak a bit about what the role of these incentives are within this process and how they even further encourage active participation in governance?
Once we have basically unlocked governance resilience and accessibility with AI tools and with properly building out the alignment artifacts, right? This sort of rule set and data structure that gives the system kind of a mind on its own, right? Then we can proceed to what's kind of like the final piece of Endgame in terms of achieving this like Endgame State, right? So that is governance participation rewards. So, I mean, the big problem with DAOs, and especially Maker in many ways, is voter apathy, right? Because it's like, today, it's super difficult to participate, right? It's very complicated. It's very difficult. So there's like this huge barrier to entry. And then like you don't gain anything from participating. You have to pay for it actually because you got to pay gas costs. And you can just do nothing and then someone else will have to figure it out, right? And then what ends up happening is it collapses down to just being the whales because they're sort of like last man standing is like whoever the largest whales are. Then no one else is doing it. So of course they have to do it. Otherwise they have the most at risk, right? And so with governance participation rewards, you kind of like completely eliminate that dynamic and replace it with a different dynamic, which has its own set of problems, right? But the new dynamic is suddenly everyone's going to be voting because they get paid to vote. So they're going to be like, I want to get paid. So I'll go and vote, right? The downside with now you solve voter apathy. Now you've got tons of people voting. The huge downside you've created is they're not particularly intelligent voters, right? Because they're not actually there as their number one priority is not to improve the system. Their number one priority is to make some money by getting these rewards, right? But that's where, basically all the other stuff we've discussed the whole time, right? That's where these are the things that allow this final step to be safe. And the reason is just like you put a lot of guardrails around subDAOs, right? And then you kind of let them do their thing. The alignment artifacts and all these rules and the whole, Endgame is all built around just putting guardrail after guardrail after guardrail around these people that come in to get voting rewards. And sort of the idea is, again, is sort of taking back to like the video game user experience, right? That it should feel like, okay, you're here to get voter rewards. You may as well participate in this sort of simple, easy, kind of gamified and ideally fun, right, experience of spending, 5 seconds thinking about what's in the best interest of the DAO, right? And there is also a big commitment actually in getting the governance participation rewards as well. So you do kind of lock up your tokens. So you have a greater exposure and you're going to have some vested interest in not seeing it fail beyond what you would have if you just held the tokens, right? And so the end game and this thing, we call it the easy governance front end, which is this sort of default, highly secure, decentralized front end that will be available to holders of the governance tokens, right? It basically guides the users through a process that they have to complete in order to be able to get the rewards. And it involves sort of picking what we call a governance strategy provided by these new constructs called aligned voter committees, which are basically other MKR holders. So it's basically, it's these aligned voter committees are basically groups of MKR holders. So they have themselves to also be MKR holders. It's not enough that they're just like insiders and contributors. They have to actually hold MKR to do this, right? So you've got this alignment where MKR holders are sort of like the more active MKR holders are helping the less active MKR holders with basically presenting them different options that they can pick. And then very fundamentally, there's these different kind of decision-making spectra that you pick from. And the most fundamental one is something like, do I want to increase budgets or do I want to decrease budgets? Because like we were talking about earlier, it always comes back to budgets. And that's like the most fundamental thing is like, should we spend more? Should we spend less? Should we focus more on the short term? Should we focus more on the long term, right? So that's like the most fundamental decision that we hope the system can bring out a little bit of kind of wisdom of the crowd, of every single person that's ultimately they're just there to get the rewards. But as they're there, they may as well think for a little bit and sort of input their opinion, right? And then, ideally with all of these guardrails and all of these checks and balances, we end up with something like wisdom of the crowd, where if you really ask everyone if they think budgets should go up or down, then you may end up with like a pretty good aggregate kind of answer around what is the ideal kind of safe consensus approach to how we should do budgeting right now. And then of course also a number of other decisions. Luckily though, they're not like too complex, and that goes back to the subDAOs again, right? That in the end it is somewhat limited actually what even has to be decided. So it's kind of like layer upon layer of security measure, right? Like it's not very complex, but we still make it really, really easy to like make sure that even the few decisions that do have to be made, we don't take that lightly. Like you really have to be very serious about making sure the right decisions are made for that, right? And then we have this lockup, so you've got extra skin in the game, but we also make it gamified, so it's easy for you, so you don't have to go out of your way to make a decision that's good for yourself. And yeah, like all in all, this is kind of the thing that's gonna lock it down, set it in stone, right? Because once you've got all these incentivized voters, and you've got this system that sort of self-regulates through a data structure that can kind of run itself, essentially, right? And that knows how to protect itself, that knows how to maintain its own equilibrium, and that knows how to like integrate new data to benefit its core purpose of generating more value for the ecosystem and also generating public good to kind of remain in balance with the external world in a sense. I mean, there's nothing that can stop something like this because nobody is going to basically, I guess you could say, no one will profit from stopping it, right? Everyone will benefit from helping it and from making it stronger and from kind of just getting closer to this sort of universally aligned, immutable, autonomous, secure, self-growing end state, right? That it will always be, I mean, it will never fully get there, but it will always continuously go in that direction.
Yeah, this is such fascinating stuff. And to be honest, while listening to you, I can't help but think that what you are laying out here right now will be one of the most interesting case studies in every single business school and Ivy League university in the next 10 years. The concepts that you're trying to crack are like existential problems that every single centralized organization has been struggling with. We're speaking about operational efficiency, incentive alignment, bringing autonomy to operations. And what you're trying to do is establish the frameworks and parameters that take these really hard to solve management issues and make them work in a fully decentralized, autonomous environment. And if you're able to pull that off, that will be the case study of the century. Just moving on to phase 5 of the Endgame update, which was the phase that actually surprised me the most, was the plan of deploying a new blockchain. Can you speak about what the rationale behind deploying a new blockchain is?
Yeah, it's also the thing that I guess surprised me the most as a self-proclaimed Ethereum maximalist, right? So I'll get to the kind of the real reason why it's needed in the end. But first, I guess a way to kind of help make sense of it is we've gone through all these stages. We've built all these different components. We've built new tokens, subDAOs, farming mechanism, the allocation system, this sort of ecosystem of subDAOs and how they interact with each other, governance rewards. Like, I mean, there's so many sort of different bits and pieces that will have kind of been built in some sense on top of each other on Ethereum, right? So it's everything's just like you've got the existing multi-collateral DAI, then you build on top of that, then you build some more stuff on top of that. Everything is kind of like built together sort of somewhat organically over time, right? And what then happens with the new blockchain is, I mean, because then in the end it reaches this, you get to governance rewards, and now you're sort of in the endgame state where like now it's not going to change anymore because no one's in control, right? Like the voters are now just sort of like voting to get paid. And as they vote to get paid, they vote to keep things the way they are because that's how everything is designed, right? So we've reached the end state. And then there is a huge amount of efficiency gains to unlock by then treating everything up until that point, like all technical implementations up until that point, as sort of technical debt, right? In a sense that, I mean, all those decisions were organically made without understanding the whole, right? And by introducing a brand new blockchain, you can design like the entire stack end to end with the full kind of architecture in mind, right? So things like the security model of the blockchain can be tuned to basically follow kind of the security model of the DAO itself, right? Because there's actually no point in because of how the stablecoin works and how the DAO works, you can't really make it more secure by putting it on a blockchain that is more secure than the DAO itself, right? Like the security will always just sort of degrade to whatever security the DAO can maintain. And then there's all this stuff around like tokenomics, these very advanced sort of what we call the neural tokenomics, which is this very advanced, almost like AI-like mechanism of distributing token value and then recapturing it and sort of continue like sort of this cycle of distributing it broadly out and then recapturing sort of signals. I mean, some basic questions like which tokens do people farm and actually hold on to versus which ones do they farm and dump. That's actually a kind of important signal that is in some sense a governance decision, right? Even though you wouldn't think so, then which token you choose to farm, which subDAO you choose to farm is actually almost like voting, and it's going to impact the behavior of the ecosystem. And so the more efficient you can make that, the more intelligent you actually make the system, right? The more fundamental value do you create in terms of the system making the right decisions, right? But anyway, like the thing is, all of this is still just like actually just like a nice side effect, nice bonus. In the end, it would never be worth it to gain all these advantages if the cost you have to pay is to like stop being sort of natively based on Ethereum mainnet, right? Because I mean, that's just, I mean, in the end, it's just you want to keep things the way they are. Like, there's no reason to do stuff you don't have to do. Even if, I mean, there's a lot of efficiency arguments and so on. But in the end, I mean, obviously, yeah, as an Ethereum maximalist, I mean, it's obvious that Ethereum is the kind of the central blockchain of the future, right? Sort of where all the network effects will occur, right? So you have to be present on Ethereum. So yeah, there needs to be a really, really good reason to kind of move off Ethereum, right? And so that really, really good reason is in the end actually sort of a surprisingly esoteric governance detail, basically. I mean, and nobody knows this stuff, right? It's only very few people think about this or know about this, but this is the absolute key to like maker governance and to this whole thing, right? The whole security of DAI, right? It's all based around this idea that you can kind of escalate misalignment, right? So the most basic thing is if something's wrong, I mean, then you can vote, and then MKR holders should vote to improve the system so that it's better, because that should be in their own interest, right? But then the problem is, what if the MKR holders are bad? Like, what if they are wrong, basically? And this is a fundamental problem in all of DeFi, where actually I think every single other DeFi protocol in the whole world, right? If, I mean, and often they're not even controlled by their token holders, right? But if they are controlled by their token holders, then if the token holders decide we're going to steal all the money, then actually it's game over. They're just going to steal all the money. And there's actually no solution to that problem, right? Anywhere in DeFi except in Maker. So in Maker, we do have a solution because, I mean, yeah, we take security and we're stablecoin, right? So it's like that kind of outcome is not acceptable to us, right? And the big problem with it is there's a huge incentive to actually do that. You're kind of like trusting people every single day to not pick what's in their best interest, self-interest, right? If they were rational, they should steal the money. They're choosing not to do it because they're sort of, they believe in like a greater good than just making money, right? And that's kind of how most DeFi works, right? In Maker, there is this thing called the emergency shutdown, which is basically a form of minority stakeholder protection. So like a majority of MKR holders, they can make arbitrary decisions, right? But a much smaller minority, they can at any time choose to shut down the protocol. So what that means is if a malicious majority does a governance attack where they tries to steal all the collateral, then the rational thing for an honest minority to do will be to shut down the protocol, because you're better off shutting it down so nothing gets stolen if it's already compromised. And if you don't shut it down, then what'll happen is just tons of money will get stolen, right? So this is a way to kind of like game theoretically create, I mean, well, it's like like a Nash equilibrium somewhat, right? Like where you're just not, even if you are purely selfish and you just want to make as much money as possible, you're still not going to try to steal the funds, because you're always going to be worse off if the protocol gets shut down, because now your MKR tokens are even worthless, right? The problem, unfortunately, with this mechanism is it introduces a new problem. And this is kind of like classic crypto, right? A classic governance is like every time you got a problem, then you make some solution, and then the solution becomes the problem, right? So the problem with emergency shutdown as it exists today is that this is now the new most dangerous and biggest vulnerability in the system. Is anyone can shut it down, right? It can also be shut down maliciously. The good news is nobody's going to make money from doing it, but it also means it's quite inexpensive compared to kind of doing a real governance attack. It's relatively inexpensive to like shut down the whole thing and just like nuke the project, right? And destroy the stablecoin, and for like trolling, or I don't know, maybe an adversarial state or something would do it, or whoever, whatever, right? The problem is this is a real problem that exists today. And unfortunately, while, I mean, the theory of emergency shutdown is this sort of smooth unwinding of the system, right, where everything is just settled out, and everyone gets their, instead of holding DAI, right, then what they get is they get the underlying value of the collateral. But in practice, I mean, we know that it would be a calamitous event, right? It would be, you'd have a crash in the Ethereum price. You'd have like crazy congestion as people try to redeem the collateral. You'd have tons of like legal issues. And this is the worst part, like all the legal implications of DAI holders trying to claim real world assets. It's just like disastrous. It's like unacceptably bad that this is possible to occur, right? So, I mean, we've actually been grappling with that problem for the whole time of the project, because we had the solution of emergency shutdown from the very beginning. Like what we always wanted was this ability to like smoothly recover and be like, okay, we shut down, but then we sort of put it back together. So as a user, you don't have to go through this like painful process of redeeming your funds. And I mean, you'll definitely never use the project again if you have to go through, you're forced to do something like that with your savings, right? Which are meant to be stable and safe, right? So, I mean, the solution is replace the emergency shutdown with hard forks, basically. So the hard fork kind of governance mechanism is kind of the method of escalation, you could say, that kind of goes beyond shutdown, that just like shuts it down. Instead, it's a way for like all of the honest participants, I guess, right? They can all agree, let's migrate to this other state where the bad ones are just forked out of the system. And then by combining this with the alignment artifacts, then you can have a really good sense of like, what does it mean to be a bad actor? What does it mean to be a good actor? That's all this data like, there's going to be this, massive amounts of data enhanced like AI tools, right? Over years and years of sort of proactive effort to really like precisely define when is someone an attacker. So you hard fork and you remove them. When was it legitimate and someone else was the attacker, and then the shutdown, sort of the hard fork happened for legitimate reasons. Like you got to have like clear rules around it. And of course, it's still possible that you actually can't resolve the situation, and you've got sort of what I call a governance breakdown. We just got some kind of like weird governance edge case where you don't have a clean resolution, and so you can't do a hard fork because you can't agree on what should the hard fork, like what is the idea, what is the correct state according to the rules. Then you still have no choice. You've got to do a real shutdown. But the good thing is you can't sort of troll the system anymore and just like force a shutdown for any reason. It can only happen in very rare and probably impossible cases, right? So it eliminates the biggest problem with the system today, the biggest sort of long-term resilience issue. Then it does introduce one new major problem, right? And that is kind of the bridge problem to Ethereum, and specifically the security of the staked ETH and the ETH collateral of the system. And so our solution to this is something called the two-stage bridge. And it's the best possible bridge design you can make when you kind of accept the reality that bridges from two blockchains to each other are basically just kind of multi-sigs, essentially, right? And so the basic idea of this two-stage bridge solution is that over time, as Ethereum grows, if it remains valuable and decentralized, then you will have truly decentralized DAOs and governance processes exist on Ethereum natively. And if it's big enough and if it's open enough and transparent enough, then these DAOs and governance processes that run natively in Ethereum, they will be aligned. Like they will not be malicious. Just like today, like all the protocols today, they're not, at least all of them are not getting governance attacked all at once, even though in theory, like we were talking about earlier, they should do that if people are selfish, right? But they aren't, because humans, especially in aggregate, and if they're set up the right way in the right context, there's more to just making a lot of money, like quick money today. There's sort of a longer term and bigger picture, right? So the bridge should rely on basically letting the native DAOs and the native governance processes on Ethereum be kind of the final sort of judges of which hard fork to choose if the new blockchain hard forks, right? And then my basic thesis for why this works is basically that if ETH remains a valuable crypto, which I expect it to be, right? I expect it to become more and more valuable over time, right? But that value is derived in a decentralized use case and a decentralized value proposition. And that is only going to exist if there are real DAOs on Ethereum. Like if we end up in a future where there are no real DAOs on Ethereum, there's no real governance in Ethereum, it's all just like a bunch of multi-sigs or a bunch of companies or centralized stablecoins, then I don't think in the long run that ETH will be a valuable asset. And so we will not, in that scenario, it wouldn't be that important that the security of the bridge wasn't as solid, because there just wouldn't be that much exposure to it, because Ethereum just wouldn't be that interesting. But I think the other thing is going to happen, right? I think that Ethereum is going to be so interesting that there will be a critical mass of like trustworthy, aligned, transparent, decentralized DAOs, and we can actually use those to basically keep the bridge secure, even if Maker itself has kind of a meltdown, basically.
Got it. Yeah. Having covered all the phases 1 through 5 of the Endgame update, let's zoom out a bit and look at the big picture to wrap this up. With everything that you're introducing, how do you see this update positioning Maker within both the stablecoin market and then the market in general? Because streamlining operations, unifying brands, enabling parallelized innovation, you speak a lot about gamification and making saving fun, which to me sounds like you're really trying to build a business operation which is targeting like a mass market. So can you just kind of sum up where you see this update taking Maker in the long run?
What we see as the objective is it's not about how we position ourselves in the crypto market, because to your point, the whole point is to go beyond the kind of somewhat like closed ecosystem of crypto and actually make these amazing primitives and products, right? Decentralized finance, financial gamification, transparency, resilience, all of this stuff, make that available to regular people in the real world, right? The age-old mission of crypto since the very beginning is financial inclusion, right? And there's been a lot of distractions over the years and failed experiments and so on, right? And this is what Maker and DAI set out to achieve from the start, right? That's what I'm really hoping, is that this will actually establish crypto and stable coins as like a completely normal thing that people do, because it allows them to basically make their financial decisions fun, right? And makes it easier to understand, and makes them feel more safe, and sort of make them understand that there's a way for them to actually verify that their money is safe, right? They don't just have to trust some authority. Like they can literally directly read the rules and have an AI analyze it for them to verify that they're safe. If they want to do that. I mean, they probably don't want to do that, but they could, right? And they'll know that others can do that. And while others are basically doing that, then they can have fun, kind of like picking subDAOs, right? Maybe, kind of understanding the connection between things like what you can get out of your money and what that means in terms of where that money is going and how that's generating growth in different ways, right? And then how you can contribute with your own decision or your own participation to increase that efficiency potentially, right? And I think there's like a massive opportunity for that. And I think that there's so many people today that they get into crypto all excited, and then they get burned on like Ponzi schemes and, like stupid ideas, basically, because those are the ones that have the flashing lights and have the fun user experience and is able to attract them. And we want to replace all that with something that's gonna, it's still fun, it's still attractive, it's still flashy, if that's what you like, right? I mean, there's gonna be something for everyone with subDAOs, right? But the key thing is they're no longer just gonna get in with high hopes and get burned and sort of like spit out and never to return, right? We want to keep them in, and we want to just keep building the cake and make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And the best part is, and this is what I'm really looking forward to myself, right, is there's not going to need to be any single team or any single person or company or anything like that to make this work, right? It's going to be this giant data structure, basically. It's going to be all these like rules that will ultimately make it all running, and they'll just keep improving themselves, and they'll do that by bringing all these people in and just like doing that little bit of like data mining out of them, right? Just get a little bit of the wisdom of the crowd out of every single participant, and then have solid, open, transparent data structures to kind of process all those decentralized inputs and just keep the system moving forward and keep it growing and keep it fresh and sharp, right? Let the subDAOs innovate and just continues to evolve to find new ways to attract more and more people. Again, I guess I'm speaking sort of personally, right? I'm looking forward to then just like leaning back and watching it all play out without having to ever get in the trenches ever again, right? And I can just sit back and watch it all unfold.
Love it. And like I said, this can be the case study of the century. So can't wait to see how everything plays out. And best of luck to you, Rune, and the team. And I hope that once everything's said and done, you get the chance to rest as well. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks so much for having me.